The bathroom mirror doesn't lie. That morning on Father's Day, I stared at a 66-year-old man wearing a faded blue-collared shirt, the kind washed so many times the fabric had stopped fighting. My hands were thick and scarred from 40 years of pouring concrete and setting steel bridge beams. For a second, I thought about changing into something newer, something that wouldn't give Richard Montgomery another reason to smirk that cold, arrogant smile of his. Then I thought about my late wife, Clara. Before she passed 11 years ago, she used to press her palm against my chest and say, "Harold, you are more than what you wear or own. Don't ever let a wealthy man make you feel small." I left the shirt on and picked up my keys. What Richard Montgomery, my daughter's wealthy father-in-law, didn't know was that I wasn't just a retired union foreman living on a modest pension in Pasadena. 22 years ago, I quietly founded Sterling Heritage Trust, a private investment firm managed out of Century City holding over $300 million in assets. And 6 months ago, when Richard's company, Montgomery Infrastructure LLC, was 70 days away from total bankruptcy, my trust quietly injected $25 million to pull him back from the brink. My current wife of 7 years, Evelyn, knew none of this. She only knew my pension covered our bills. I kept it secret because I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what was in my bank account. As I poured my morning coffee, my phone buzzed. It was my 10-year-old grandson, Leo. "Grandpa, are you coming tonight?" he asked excitedly. "I made your Father's Day card on Thursday, and I've been waiting to give it to you." My throat tightened. "I'll be there, buddy. Wouldn't miss it." Then Leo dropped his voice to a whisper. "Grandpa, Dad said Grandpa Richard is going to be there and told me you should just stay calm, but you're always calm." I stood silently in the kitchen. I had known for weeks what Richard was, how he had misused the trust funds, and how he looked down on me. I wasn't afraid. There is a vast difference between a man who acts out of sudden anger and a man who acts when his trap is fully set. As I drove toward Bel Air, I knew tonight was going to shatter the entire family. But I had no idea that a single hand-drawn card from my grandson was about to spark an explosive legal war. My wife Evelyn sat tense in the passenger seat of my old pickup truck as we pulled into the gates of Bel Air. She wore pearl earrings and a designer blouse, constantly adjusting her hair. "Harold, please," she warned, her voice tight. "Don't bring up your old construction stories tonight. Just let Richard lead the conversation so everyone has a nice evening." I looked at her quietly. "You're asking me to make myself smaller so Richard Montgomery feels bigger. I just don't want to be embarrassed by how it looks," she snapped. Her words stung, but I kept my composure. "I was only at this dinner for my grandson, Leo. Richard Montgomery met us at the grand stone steps of his sprawling white mansion, holding a glass of vintage champagne. On his wrist flashed a $70,000 Patek Philippe watch. His eyes swept over my faded shirt and worn boots in 2 seconds flat. "Harold," he drawled condescendingly, "glad you made it all the way from the valley in that old truck of yours." When I handed him a fresh homemade apple pie I had spent 2 hours baking, Richard didn't even look at it. He snapped his fingers at a house server. "Take this box to the kitchen staff entrance out back." I took a slow breath, remembering my values, and walked into the backyard where 15 high society guests were gathered. Richard stood at the center of the patio, bragging loudly to his corporate partners about how he had single-handedly saved his company from supply chain headwinds. I took a slow sip of water. What Richard would never admit in front of his wealthy friends was that his company hadn't turned any corner on its own. It was my $25 million wire transfer that saved him. And looking at the $70,000 watch on his wrist, I realized he had bought it just 3 days after my trust money hit his business account. When dinner was called, Richard personally directed the seating. He placed his wealthy business partners at the head of the long mahogany table under the crystal chandelier. Then he pointed at me. "Harold, we'll put you down at the very far end near the kitchen door. More room for you to stretch out." He was isolating me near the noise and servers, but before I could move, 10-year-old Leo grabbed my hand, looked Richard right in the eye, and did something that stunned the entire room. Leo pulled my hand firmly, sat right next to me at the far end of the table, and crossed his arms. "I'm sitting with Grandpa Harold," he announced in a clear, unshakable voice. Richard's smile tightened. "Leo, your seat is up front near the orchids." "Grandpa Richard moved his seat twice already," Leo said bluntly. "That's not very polite." The entire dining room fell dead silent. Richard's face flushed red, but he forced a fake laugh to brush it off. Beneath the linen tablecloth, Leo squeezed my fingers and whispered, "Don't let them make you small, Grandpa." He pulled a folded, creased piece of paper from his pocket, a drawing of us fishing together with the words, "For the best, Grandpa." I folded it carefully and placed it directly over my heart in my breast pocket. As the main course arrived, a server placed a massive platter of prime rib near our end of the table. Richard immediately marched over, reached across my shoulder, and snatched the platter away. "I'll take care of this," Richard announced loudly. "This end of the table is a bit out of the way for the premium cuts." I set my fork down slowly. "I hadn't touched it, Richard," I said evenly. "The server placed it there." Richard slammed the silver platter onto the wood, his face turning dark red. "Let me be clear, Harold. This is my house, my table, and the people sitting up front contribute to this family in meaningful ways. A man who spent his life pouring concrete for other people doesn't get to look at me like that." I sat up straight and looked him in the eye. "I'm looking at you the only way I know how, Richard. Straight." Without warning, Richard struck me. The back of his heavy hand cracked hard across my left cheek. The violent crack echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. My head snapped sideways, the sharp taste of copper filling my mouth. My daughter Sarah gasped in horror. My son-in-law Mark froze in total shock. Then my wife Evelyn stood up, looked at my bruised cheek, and said, "Harold, just apologize to Richard right now. Stop making this worse." I wiped the blood from the corner of my mouth, stood up in dignified silence, and prepared to walk out. But before I took 3 steps, 10-year-old Leo pushed his chair back, ran across the marble floor, and threw his arms around my waist, sobbing hysterically. Then Leo turned around, placed his small body between me and the entire room, pointed a trembling finger directly at Richard, and screamed words that brought the entire mansion to a standstill. "You hit my grandpa," Leo sobbed, his voice ringing through the silent dining room. "You hit him and nobody did anything. Mom didn't do anything. Dad didn't do anything. That is wrong." Richard tried to step forward with fake patience. "Leo, sit down. The adults are handling this." "You're not handling it," the 10-year-old shouted back, tears streaming down his face. "You hit him and told him to say sorry. Mom always told me to stand up to bullies. Why isn't anyone standing up for Grandpa?" My daughter Sarah buried her face in her hands, weeping. My son-in-law Mark stood frozen, looking at his son's raw courage, a profound shame washing over his face. I crouched down, wrapped my hands around Leo's trembling face, and whispered, "You are the bravest person in this room, buddy." Then I stood up, reached into my pocket, and dialed a number from memory. David Sterling, my chief legal counsel at Century City, answered on the second ring. "Harold," David said instantly, "we're ready." "Activate the final option," I ordered calmly. "Bring the entire team to the Montgomery estate right now." "We are 15 minutes away," David replied. Richard let out an arrogant laugh, picking up his champagne glass. "Calling your lawyer, Harold. You're going to lawyer up over a family disagreement." "It wasn't a disagreement, Richard," I said, my voice cold as iron. "You committed assault in front of 15 witnesses. There is no other version." 15 minutes later, the grand front doors of the mansion swung open without a knock. David Sterling strode into the dining room wearing a tailored suit, carrying a black leather briefcase. Behind him filed 2 senior corporate litigators, an independent forensic accountant, a senior risk vice president from Pacific Coast Bank, and Tom Briggs, the chief financial officer of Montgomery Infrastructure, LLC. The air pressure in the room instantly plummeted. David walked straight past the frozen guests, stopped in front of me, and turned to the crowd. "Good evening," David announced, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "My name is David Sterling. I represent Sterling Heritage Trust. I am here on behalf of the trust's founder and sole beneficial owner, Chairman Harold Vance." The silence in the room was deafening. Richard's champagne glass tilted in his hand, almost slipping from his fingers. He stared at me in total disbelief. "Chairman, Harold Vance is a retired construction foreman who drove here in a pickup truck. What are you talking about?" David opened his briefcase with 2 sharp clicks and laid a thick stack of legal documents onto the white tablecloth. "Sterling Heritage Trust holds $300 million in assets. 6 months ago, at Chairman Vance's direction, we extended a secured $25 million investment to save your failing company." Richard's face turned ghastly pale as David prepared to deliver the knockout blow. Forensic accountant Victor Reyes stepped forward, setting a digital drive on the table. Tom Briggs, the CFO of Richard's company, looked at Richard with a sad, final expression. "I tried to raise these financial red flags internally twice, Richard," Tom said. "You told me to sweep it under the rug. I didn't." David Sterling opened the primary audit ledger and read the findings aloud to the entire room. Over the past 4 months, Richard Montgomery illegally transferred $3.5 million of invested trust capital into a fake shell company named Crestline Advisory. David looked up, locking eyes with Richard's sister, Beatrice. Crestline Advisory's sole registered officer is Beatrice Montgomery. Transfers to a family shell company with zero documented services constitute grand embezzlement and federal wire fraud. Beatrice gasped, dropping her wine glass as the entire room stared at her in utter shock. David continued. Furthermore, Mr. Montgomery charged $75,000 of personal luxuries to the corporate credit card, including a Patek Philippe watch bought in Beverly Hills 3 days after a wire transfer hit his account. Richard's business partner, Frank, shoved his chair back in disgust. "Richard, I'm calling my attorney immediately," Frank snapped, walking out of the mansion without looking back. Then David produced the final, most devastating document, an emergency wire authorization form dated 6 weeks ago, transferring $800,000, bearing the electronic signature of my son-in-law, Mark. Sarah gasped, looking at her husband. "Mark, why is your signature on that?" Mark ran to the table, picking up the document with shaking hands. "I was in Portland 6 weeks ago," Mark yelled, his voice cracking with rage. "I never signed this. Dad, you forged my electronic signature. You were going to let me take the fall for federal fraud." Richard stood paralyzed at the head of the table, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He had set up his own son-in-law to go to prison if the audit ever caught up with him. Mark turned to David Sterling, his eyes wet with tears. "I will cooperate completely with the federal investigation. I have emails, documents, and private text messages proving he forced me to sign altered contracts." David nodded. "Full cooperation ensures you will receive a non-prosecution agreement from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Our firm will represent you free of charge." Richard collapsed heavily into his chair, his hands covering his face. His phone began ringing uncontrollably. His board of directors had just received the forensic audit report. The empire he had built on arrogance and stolen money was crumbling around his ears in real time. David Sterling pulled out a final court order stamped by the United States District Court. "A federal temporary restraining order has just been granted by Judge Patricia Howe," David announced. "All personal and corporate assets belonging to Richard and Beatrice Montgomery, including this Bel Air estate, bank accounts, and vehicles, are frozen effective immediately pending federal indictment." Beatrice tried to grab her car keys to leave, but David looked at her calmly. "Your vehicle is registered under the restricted corporate entity. Driving it tonight constitutes illegal disposal of seized assets. I suggest you call a taxi." Within 30 minutes, law enforcement vehicles pulled into the long stone driveway. Federal agents entered the estate to secure the financial servers and hand Richard his formal court summons. I looked at Richard sitting defeated at the head of his ruined table, surrounded by cold food and melted ice. The $70,000 watch on his wrist couldn't save him now. I leaned down and picked up my grandson Leo, holding him close. My daughter Sarah came over, tears streaming down her face, and hugged me tightly. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I should have stood up for you sooner." "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered gently. 4 months ago, I established an independent, irrevocable trust for you, Mark, and Leo. I paid off your home mortgage in full and transferred the title clean into your name. Richard's legal disaster can never touch your home or your family's future." Sarah wept on my shoulder, overwhelmed by the quiet, protective love I had built for them behind the scenes. 3 months later, Richard Montgomery and his sister were formally indicted on 8 counts of federal wire fraud and grand embezzlement. The Bel Air estate was placed under court-ordered liquidation. Mark took a clean management position at a reputable firm in Pasadena, sleeping peacefully for the first time in years. My wife Evelyn and I agreed to part ways quietly. She realized too late that she had chosen status over true character, while I returned to my peaceful home in Pasadena. Today, I sit on my back porch in the warm September sun, drinking coffee with Leo. He sits beside me, showing me his latest school drawings. I still drive my old pickup truck, and I still wear my faded blue shirts. Money didn't save me that night in Bel Air. Knowing who I was before I walked through that door is what kept my spine straight. Real strength isn't about flexing wealth or making other people feel small. It's about having the quiet courage to protect the people you love.